So really happy to be at this point of the event. We're really so honored to have Maria Rosario Jackson with us today. I've known Maria for a number of years. So much of my work has been inspired by things I've read of hers, as well as some of the many conversations I've been fortunate to have with her over a number of years. And I've known her in a few different capacities through her work with ASU, the Kresge Foundation, Urban Institute, and of course now with the National Endowment for the Arts. And for more than 25 years, Chair Jackson's work has been focused on the understanding and elevating arts, culture, and design as critical elements of healthy communities. Her work blends social sciences and arts and humanities-based approaches to comprehensive community revitalization, systems change, and the dynamics of race and ethnicity, and the roles of arts and culture in communities. After her confirmation by the Senate last December, Dr. Jackson became the 13th chair of the NEA in January of this year. With this historic appointment, Dr. Jackson is the nation's first NEA chair to be an African-American and Mexican-American woman. I'm really excited for her to be here today. I know you all will benefit just as much as I have from hearing her speak. With that, I will hand things over to Maria. Please take it away.
Thank you, Ben. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to virtually join you and take part in Smart Growth's ongoing equity summits. I'm grateful to Smart Growth America for inviting me to share some thoughts with you today. And I'm also grateful to all of you in attendance for what you do. It's important, whether you're a transportation professional, public servant, community developer. I'm eager to share some thoughts with you, and so happy that you're interested in learning about the connection or exploring the connection between arts, culture, and design and your work. The last 2.5 years have been challenging, to say the least. A pandemic, heightened racial reckoning, social and political polarization, global instability, and environmental challenges. And it continues to be an extraordinary time, full of trials and tragedy, but also full of evidence of strength and resilience and possibility. Not surprisingly, that evidence of strength and resilience is often connected to creativity in the arts. Our creativity and imagination have allowed us to respond, adapt, step up. And as I think about the role of the arts now and even historically, in addition to the vital economic impact of the sector, the arts are crucial to our health and well-being. They help us mourn, celebrate, speak out, cope, connect, find both meaningful differences and our common humanity. And we see this nationally, locally, and globally. You might wonder why someone with a background in urban planning, which is my root field, urban planning and community development, why would I be interested in leading an agency like the National Endowment for the Arts? And I'll tell you, my commitment to the arts started early, and it started at home. And my parents were not artists, and they weren't wealthy arts patrons. They actually resorted to the arts because they wanted resources to help raise my brother and me to be proud of our cultures. They wanted us to understand where they and where we came from, that our history was rich and complex, that we were connected to people who were brilliant and capable of genius. And they wanted us to be proud of our backgrounds. And they also wanted us to be curious about others, to understand similarities and differences, and really importantly, to recognize our common humanity. So early on, I understood that artists, culture bearers, designers, that they're necessary in many different ways. They help us make sense of the world. They offer us different ways of thinking, feeling, and being. They're a source of inspiration and innovation. They're critically important to our well-being and our ability to recover. And they're important because they help us protect and advance our humanity. So I'm still fairly early in my tenure as chair of the National Endowment for the Arts, and I bring to this position a collection of experiences, and some of them are squarely in what we think of as the traditional arts field, some outside of that completely. And most are what I think of as at the edges and in those places where arts and cultural activity intersect with health, community development, education, environment, and our quest towards a more just and equitable society. But it's in those interstitial spaces where a lot of my work has been, and where I think there has to be a lot more attention. Early in my career, I was sometimes discouraged from my focus on arts and culture. I would have well-meaning colleagues say, you care about injustice and the causes and consequences of poverty. You want to address racist structures and improve neighborhoods. Why are you doing this arts and culture stuff? And they would ask me this as if I was off mission. And the questions annoyed me, but I remained committed. And I didn't have the words to explain myself early in my career. Eventually, I found the words. And what I've been able to say for a number of years now is that if around the world and throughout the ages, you look at strategies to disempower or oppress, the first thing that is tampered with is one's ability to make meaning, to ask questions, to have aesthetics, to express yourself creatively, to do the things that we do through art. And I have to ask, if it's so powerful that it has to be tampered with in order to control or oppress, then why don't we understand it as core to building? So the questions about why I wasn't focused on economic development or food insecurity or other things that were much more planning-like, those bothered me too, because I don't see the arts as existing in a silo. And I don't see the arts as not relevant to these issues. I see them as central. So sure, I can be interested in affordable housing, but can the housing be well-designed, culturally appropriate, beautiful, inspiring? Can we think of housing that way? And sure, I can be interested in economic development, but can we think about building from the creativity of people who've been marginalized, and can they benefit from their genius? I can be interested in food deserts and food insecurity, but I also ask, how does that connect to the reclamation of historical narratives that have been distorted or erased? And how do food traditions, how do we see these as cultural assets? So for me, all of these opportunities for intersection are so critically important and fertile. What I've surmised over the years is that at its best, the integration of arts, culture, and design rely on a more expansive and inclusive concept of what we've held up as a society, more inclusive and more expansive than what we've typically held up, should I say. And I've been relying on 6 premises that I've gathered up and constructed over the past many years, and these have undergirded my work. I'll share them with you. The first idea is that all people have the capacity to be creative, and that creativity is an individual and a community asset from which to build. So communities are not blank slates, and what is often overlooked, especially in historically marginalized communities and communities of color, are the creativity and culture that exist in those places and among those people, those communities. Second, the ability for people to be expressive and tell their own stories on their own terms is a critical dimension of justice and equity. It's part of our American ethos. A third idea is that arts and cultural activity happens in many kinds of places, in community centers, commercial venues, parks, and public streets, not only in cultural presenting venues, which of course are really important. It can happen in many, many different diverse places. And it includes more than audience participation. People engage in the arts by making, doing, teaching, in addition to our traditional concept of consuming and as audience. A fourth idea is that art process can be as important as, or even in some cases, more important than art product. And that's sometimes a hard concept to grasp, because we're socialized to look to the end product that will be consumed as the thing that's most important. The act of being in creative process, especially collective creative process, I think also has value in and of itself. And it often generates things like agency, both individual and collective, stewardship, social cohesion. It contributes to the creation of new narratives or the reclamation of narratives that have been erased. And it enables us to hold nuance and appreciate complexity. All of these I think of as preconditions for other community goals. And we don't often lift that out of things like theories of change. And so many of us have been trained to try to depict how change is going to happen. And we often don't account for these really important preconditions. A fifth idea is that artists and designers have many kinds of relationships to publics and roles within communities. So artists and designers can help imagine policy. They can help create programs, help us understand how things are working or not, and help imagine other ways of working and envision what we aspire to do. And these aren't typically roles that we may think of artists and designers taking on, but certainly some artists and designers are very well poised and want to do this kind of work even. Not all, but some. And the sixth and last point that I'll share in these is that arts are intrinsically important, full stop. And at the same time, they're important because they contribute to other community dynamics that help address community needs and aspirations. So these things are not necessarily at odds with each other. When I started this work, there was a big debate in the arts field about intrinsic value of art versus instrumental value of art. And it was a polarized way of thinking about why the arts mattered. And I think that it doesn't always have to be polarized, that in fact, part of the value of the arts is the fact that it can hold meanings and value at the same time, different kinds of meanings and value at the same time. So these 6 ideas allow for a more expansive understanding of how arts, culture, and design can connect to the important areas of work represented among you. What I know for sure, as I look back on almost 3 decades of work in this space, is that at their most impactful, arts and design are often woven throughout what I think of as our civic infrastructure. So those mechanisms and arrangements that we rely on to care for each other. So it's not the icing on the cake or just the decorative thing that happens at the end of the project. It's actually part of the batter. It plays an important role of how we even frame the issues that we care about. And I honestly believe that we can't do our best work in building communities where people can thrive without the arts. We also have to understand that the power of the arts in this moment is particularly important. And I think of it as important in helping us to reframe, retool, and repair. And I see reframing and as understanding things differently, thinking outside of the box in ways that lead us to different solutions, looking at things from different perspectives and different worldviews. The notion of retooling has to do with devising new ways of working that I think tap into our full power, head, heart, hand, so intellectually, emotionally, and physically. And it's this ability to bring your full self and full power to your work that actually allows for breakthroughs and for transformation, for getting unstuck, as I often think of the arts as a critically important force in helping us to get unstuck. So we need to do all of these things so that we can if we don't do the work of reframing and retooling, we can't do the work of repair that's so desperately needed. and in some cases has been needed since long before the pandemic and our experience of recent years. Recognizing that artists, designers, and cultural organizations can be contributors and collaborators in how we go about building healthy community, building opportunity-rich communities, I think that's really imperative now. So from the perch of the National Endowment for the Arts, I think about the big idea of advancing artful lives for everyone. I think about building healthy arts ecosystems that support the connection between the arts and other sectors. So considering the integration of arts, culture, and design now feels particularly important and generative because over the last 2.5 years, we've been forced to reimagine how we live, how we work, how we think about things. And the idea of orthodoxy is in some ways turned on its head. There's evidence of having done things that we couldn't imagine as possible over the past 2 years. And there's also increased attention to longstanding injustice. And there have been many proclamations about wanting to address longstanding problems. So in this time, when there is an invitation to not do the same thing and an edict to repair, the question I ask often is, can we resist the impulse to snap back to business as usual? And I hope that we are able to resist the impulse to snap back as business as usual, because if we don't learn the lesson in the last few years, we've missed a big opportunity. I think that in the last 2 years, something else that has become really clear for many of us is that we've been taught about what is essential and not negotiable, foundational. What is core to who we are and who we want to be. So at the same time that we're being taught that we can do things so differently, I think what is core is also being reaffirmed. And I know from the perspective of the NEA, we understand for sure, and more profoundly than ever, that arts and artists play a central role in community life, and that all people should have access to creative lives, to artful lives. So informed by our examined experience, the NEA is also evolving. I believe that at its best, the Arts Endowment is understood as a national resource. It is a grant maker, which has been its primary identity, and it will continue to be for sure. But it is also and has been a convener, a collaborator, a thought leader, an information provider, a catalyst, and an amplifier. And I think it is a key partner in building healthy, just, and opportunity-rich communities. So as a planner in this perch, I invite you to consider a couple of important questions with me. One is, what does the infusion of art, culture, and design into our civic infrastructure, again, those mechanisms and arrangements that we rely on to care for each other, what does integration into that require? And the second question is, as we reflect on what we've learned and what we're learning, what beliefs and ways of working do we keep, alter, or shed? And how do we not snap back to business as usual when we know we can do better? So you are visionary leaders with proximity to the communities we, I think, all want to see thrive. And you help to set the course for shaping and transforming and revitalizing our nation. I'm grateful for the work that you do and excited about what we might do together, and even mindful of the challenges ahead. I'm also deeply inspired by what is possible. And I thank you for listening, and I look forward to being in conversation with you. Thank you.
Dr. Jackson, that was amazing. And We are so glad, as you said, that you found your words. We are so glad that your parents, as you said, resorted to the arts, and just appreciative of you taking the time in what is, I imagine, a very busy schedule. So thank you so much. I did want to ask you as a starting question, and then we'll see what's in the audience Q&A as well. Just going back to the concept of your parents resorting to the arts, and you talked about your kind of integrated background of both urban planning, academics, but also sort of weaving together all of these things. And you also mentioned kind of how do we weave the arts and culture into our civic infrastructure. And so I wanted to ask you so that you could sort of share with the audience, how does someone who's in the audience, who's an urban planner, who is in some discipline within this larger field of community development, who wants to understand how they can kind of access these tools, learn more about creative placemaking and the like, considering that in some ways, a lot of what you talked about isn't taught in school, and then you get out into the world and you're trying to make an impact and you're trying to figure out, well, what is your place and how do you learn about it? What would you suggest to those in the audience who want to do more, who are inspired by your words and don't know where to start?
That's a great question, Calvin, and it's good to see you again. I would start in two ways. So there are some resources that have been developed in the last 10 to 12 years. As you know, there has been investment from foundations in all kinds of organizations. And there's a lot of bottom-up grassroots work that isn't necessarily touched by philanthropy or government to pay attention to. So there are resources, some of the things that have been created through Transportation for America that I heard Ben reference earlier in the session. Those are certainly resources to look to. There is some literature now that exists in case studies and a few videos and what have you in different places that I can think of. Certainly Smart Growth America and Transportation for America is one. Policy Link has done some work related to this. LISC, the Local Initiative Support Corporation, has done some work. There are arts entities around the country that have been partners in this kind of work. In addition to looking to documentation and formal treatments of creative placemaking or related practices, I would also go to places that feel like they are culturally thriving and pay attention. And pay attention to what is it that creates a sense of belonging for the people who live there. What is it that is evidence of resisting erasure? What are the things that help mark a place as being inhabited by people who are creative with a history and that embody human complexity? I think, when I was teaching, I would take students into neighborhoods that felt that way to me and ask them to interrogate their experience and to also speak with leaders from those communities to understand what is it that they feel is important about the neighborhoods that they're proud of, invested in, et cetera, right? So I think coming at this from a number of different angles is really important. And I wanted to underscore the experiential part and the being curious about why is this place vibrant? Well, even if it's not economically vital, why does it still have this sense of cultural coherence? Why is there vitality? Why is there an evidence of pride in this place? I think getting after those questions and understanding the formal or informal systems at work in those communities is really important.
Awesome. Thank you for that answer. Makes me think of lots of other questions, as well as some ones that are sort of populating in the chat and otherwise. You talked about kind of evidence of erasure, which I like. I like the alliteration of that, by the way. And wanted to ask you, and this is a little bit of a technical question, but you know, for the audience, you know, cultural displacement as a term is used often in context, and as you saw, if you saw the word cloud, in the context of gentrification. And I know if I was doing a Venn diagram, it wouldn't be a solar eclipse in the sense that gentrification and cultural displacement are not literally the same thing. So can you explore for us just a little bit how those two intersect, but also how they might be different, and then how, as folks are facing those issues, how they should think about it?
The two concepts, Calvin, that you lifted were gentrification and cultural displacement.
Yes.
You know, gentrification is one of those lightning rod words, and I think sometimes it's not that helpful to think about gentrification as without unpacking it, right? And I think what I have been in my career particularly concerned with is the involuntary displacement of people as a result of new infusions. And it is that involuntary displacement that goes hand in hand with cultural erasure. This can, yes, it's opening up a can of worms, and I'll just peek in the can of worms in this moment. But you know, for when I was coming up and going through planning school, we were trained at the time to attract investment into urban core, often low income, Black and brown communities. That training, as well intentioned as it was, did not account for the dynamics that we're seeing in cities now. We were not prepared for what happens when there is an avalanche of infusion and drastic change. And what do you do with that? So in a sense, there's a being caught flat-footed in a way that I think planning and related fields have experienced. And trying to understand how to create equitable outcomes in the face of investment coming into a place that, or places, and this is not the same in every community around the country, but investments coming into places that had long been disinvested, and how to make sure that people who have been there and stayed there are able to benefit from this revival of interest in that place. Those are the strategies that we need to figure out, right? Those are the things that we need to tend to. And we are still, I think, in the process of devising the appropriate tools to how to, not just how to deal with it when it's already there, because sometimes that's too late, but how is one preemptive about that kind of erasure and displacement? And how does one benefit from investment that is necessary, but benefit in a way that advances folks who have been there and that celebrates the culture and creativity and vitality that I believe exists in neighborhoods that have been long disinvested because there are humans there. So how do we tend to that? I think those are the big questions.
Right. You know, and it reminds me of one of the reasons why I've always sort of disliked the term placemaking, just because it sort of presupposes that there wasn't a place already there, that there wasn't already vitality, versus keeping the place or investing in, you know, leveraging what was already there. So I totally believe. Both in the chat as a Q&A and based on something you said, I have one last question for you, which really gets to something that we find in working in the sort of larger field of smart growth, where you can execute and implement the sort of tactics and tools of smart growth, as an example, do more transit-oriented development, have people be able to live places where they're not dependent on using a car. They can choose to, but they're not dependent to on those things. Having places become more walkable, getting around in a variety of ways, on and on and all the sort of tools of smart growth. When I take that macro point and then bring it down a level to arts and culture, you sort of have the same question, which is, how do we execute and implement what you described in a way that doesn't actually exacerbate the kind of displacement and or gentrification that people are worried about? Like, what are the ways to still use the tool, but have it be a force for good?
I think that we have to think of bundles of solutions, right? So if there are investments that are made, and let me just talk about built environment. And if there are investments that are made in built environment, and as a result of those investments that may be arts investments, a place becomes much more attractive, a place becomes a target of investment. If there aren't allied strategies that have to do with preservation of affordability, that have to do with advancement of ownership for people who haven't had opportunities and foundational resources to engage in that, then we're messing up. You know, how is it that we can understand multi-pronged approaches to smart growth, inclusive of the arts, that that really advance the protection of the dignity for all, right? So there is something about thinking of how things converge. And you've opened up it's a big question, Calvin. You've opened up.
We only do the big questions here.
Well, you should. That's what this is for. I think it's worth a lot more discussion. You know, what are the different strategies that need to converge, that can and should include integration of the arts, that can and should lift up heritage and cultural assets in, historically disinvested communities. What is that bundle, or what is that constellation of different approaches that need to come together and converge into something that is actually fruitful, equitable, and just? I think it's the convergence of those strategies that we have to pay attention to.
It's a great point, and I'll say this as a plant a seed for another conversation about equity. Maybe you can join it as well, which is, it really does speak to the need for an interdisciplinary, non-siloed approach to even our federal programs.
That's right.
Because ultimately, what you just said, the bundle has to come from all of the different places that would fund that activity. And so you could do the arts and culture right, but if you also don't have part of the bundle be affordable housing, part of the bundle be missing middle, part of the bundle be affordable, accessible transportation, all of which, often our governments, these are silos. The programs are different funding sources, different opportunities. And so that kind of, if you will, whole of government approach, but in an integrated way, probably will help us get to the kind of bundled approach that you mentioned. So
I think absolutely, Calvin, and it has to happen at all levels. That integration, I'm working in a federal perch now, and I definitely see the need for precisely what you're talking about. It has to happen at region, state, and local levels as well. Yeah. Right. So if there is a way to align that that impulse to act comprehensively and in a holistic manner, that's what we need to harness. And we need to figure out whose job that is, because we are organized in silos. And not that silos are altogether bad, because I think that there is value in having areas of expertise, but when they're not porous and they can't bridge, that's when we're in trouble.
Yep. And I even saw in the chat, some folks said that planners can be the weavers of the bundle. So they're running with your analogy in real time. And I also submit too that nonprofits like ours, as intermediaries and otherwise, also can be part of the hubs, as well as groups that are literally working on the ground in localities. So you have both a top-down and a bottom-up approach, because neither one by themselves work.
That's
but how
right.
to figure out how to bring all of those forces to bear and kind of rowing in the right direction. So if this wasn't virtual, I would say someone would be literally kicking me under the table right now to say that despite how much more we could get into, and again, we appreciate you taking the time, I'm gonna have to hand this back over to Ben Stone so to kind of keep the festivities moving. But thank you so much. Hopefully this pandemic doesn't cause us not to be in the same place again soon. So hope to see you in person one day.
Thank you for having me. It was really an honor to be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Chair Jackson. Sorry, Calvin, for virtually kicking you under the table. I also would love to continue this conversation for much longer. There are a lot of fantastic questions popping up in the Q&A and in the chat. I just wanted to mention that we are going to be putting together a discussion guide after this event. This is not just a one-off sort of thing. We look forward to continuing to talking with all of you. So sorry we couldn't answer all your questions, but we look forward to compiling the discussion that's been happening virtually here and submitting it to all of you after today. Thank you again to Chair Jackson for getting us started discussing this great topic today. I will echo all the kudos that have been showing up in the chat.